The catcher position is now a strength for the Cincinnati Reds thanks to the depth that Nick Krall added this offseason. Today, we will look at the key piece that brought the position together and why it is so crucial for the Reds' growth in 2023 as we look forward to a better year of baseball.
You are Locked On Reds, your daily Cincinnati Reds podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Reds with myself, Jeff Carr, and Steve will be out today. He's going to be back tomorrow for our live edition of the podcast, but it's just you and me talking Reds baseball today on the Locked On Reds podcast. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, bringing you your team every day. Thanks as always for making us your first listen. I know I'm getting this episode out a little bit later in the day, kind of getting a little bit lax here with the holidays going on, but I also wanted the idea of yesterday's episode to marinate a little bit. If you haven't checked it out, I tell you why I think the Reds are going to win at least 75 games in 2023. And today I'm going to expound on that a little bit more, as I think that there is a key position group that the Reds struggled mightily in last year that they have improved dramatically in this year. Can't wait to tell you about that. We're also going to look at a statistic. There's not really a measurement number for a replacement level manager, but I'm going to attempt to look at something regarding David Bell and asking the question of whether or not he's a good manager. Also, there is a statistic that defines the Reds' struggles at the plate from last season that I don't think we're talking about enough. We're going to point that out later on in the show. But today we will start off with this. The Reds' catching position will be one of the reasons that the Reds win at least 75 games this year. I know that's hilarious to say based on the fact that last year the catching position was one of the reasons that they were so bad. And part of that had to do with Tyler Stephenson's injuries and having to replace him. I was looking at some projection models and things like that before last season, just a little bit ago, and they were talking about the Reds catcher position where it's Tyler Stephenson, and then they had Andrew Knapp as the backup catcher. This was before spring training, before the Reds actually reported a good year. This was the Zips projections back in December of 2021, looking ahead toward 2022, and projecting Andrew Knapp as the backup catcher back then. If you remember right, Andrew Knapp didn't even, I don't even think he played with the Reds. If he did, it was so little that I barely even remember it. Somebody needs to make a Sporkle quiz of every single player who played for the Reds last year, because it would be impossible to get that all right. There were 69 players, but Andrew Knapp doesn't ring a bell. The guys who did play weren't very good. In fact, just even looking at the statistics, and this includes the 50 games from Tyler Stephenson, Reds catchers batted a collective .210 last year. That's including Tyler Stephenson. And we've talked about how good he was in those 50 games. But as much as Tyler Stephenson is awesome, I mean, we know he's a monster hitter. We know he's a good glove and a good game caller when it comes to behind the plate. He just has health questions. Or does he? Like, I want to just kind of think about that for a minute, because the injuries that he had did not build upon one another. I mean, the broken collarbone was out of the blue, right? The concussions are a little bit worrying, but again, these were not building on it. We're not talking about Tua Tagovailoa here. We're talking about Tyler Stephenson, where he did have one, and you just don't want him to have multiple. But still, I don't think that Tyler Stephenson is injury prone, and yet Nick Krall did the right thing. Nick Krall made the catcher position probably the deepest position. Actually, I don't even know that it's probably. The catcher position might actually be the deepest position on the roster. And again, this is a huge reason why I think that the Reds will be better next year, is because they were so inconsistent and they had to rely on Joe Schmo and Joe Schmo number 2 to come in and catch for them in 2022. So I think that with the guys that they brought in, and Curt Casali being the key piece to the depth of this position for the Reds, and listen, Curt Casali, that move, you're going to look at his statistics and say, well, Jeff, he didn't hit very well last year. Still hit better than most backup catchers that played for the Reds, but still, they weren't necessarily that great in numbers. But consider two things when it comes to Curt Casali. Last year, he had 1 walk for every 2 strikeouts. That's the kind of rate that you would love to see with more players in today's game. That's a huge problem that we have with Jose Barrero. It's a huge problem we had with Aristides Aquino. Reason why he's not on the roster anymore is because he struck out way too much. There was way too many at-bats where he was providing nothing. He wasn't putting the ball in play at all. So whenever Curt Casali strikes out, he still walks enough that you look at that and you say, okay, that probably overweighs that a little bit. Plus, consider this as well. His career at Great American Ballpark is awesome. Curt Casali, 265 career hitter in over 100 games at Great American Ballpark and slugs 440 at GABP. So he is going to be happy to come back to Cincinnati. And he even said that on the hot stove the other night with Tommy Thrall, is that he was, like, I have unfinished business here and I'm glad to be back and to finish that business. And overall, he's solid behind the plate defensively. He's nothing crazy. But again, this is the kind of guy that you want in a backup catcher. Curt Casali is going to provide some pop. He's going to provide some defense. He's going to provide that veteran ability, the guy who's been there, right? Luke Maile was a fine addition as well. He's a good third option for sure. If you're telling me, because whenever they signed him as the backup catcher, I was like, okay, that's fine. I don't necessarily know that I love it, but as a third catcher, I do love it. I mean, he kind of broke out. I mean, not really broke out, but he at least showed that he can be a competent major leaguer last year with the Guardians. So I think he can probably build on that a little bit, but he has the experience and he is better than anything that the Reds rolled out there in the second half of last season. Again, that bar is not very high, but this is just to show you the difference in this position this year. It is deep enough. The Luke Maile experience, Curt Casali experience, and just for those who want to ask about these two guys, the Reds actually brought back Austin Romine and Chucky Robinson on minor league deals. So they are now 5 deep when it comes to guys who have major league experience. I don't want to see Austin Romine and Chucky Robinson, but if the Reds have to, they can go to that well. Supposing that, both those guys stick through camp and they don't find a major league job somewhere else. But I look at this and I say that Nick Krall did a fantastic job of making the catching position so deep for the Cincinnati Reds that it has become the strength of this roster, and it will be a reason that the Reds have a much better season in 2023. One of the biggest advantages to having such a deep catching position, and we've said this before, but especially with Casali and with Maile, it opens up the possibility to keep Tyler Stephenson in the lineup without having him catch 162 games, which is something that nobody will ever do ever again. I know lots of people like to point back to the catchers, really not even that far. Like I was about to say Johnny Bench, but even back to like Mike Piazza and stuff like that. Like guys are not going to catch that much anymore. We understand that teams need to have multiple guys who can play behind the plate. But with the bat that Tyler Stephenson has, you don't want to take that out of the lineup to give him a day off. You can give him a bit of a rest, give his knees a rest, give his possibility of getting hit by a foul ball a rest by putting him at first base or putting him at DH for, who knows, 50 games this year, 60 games. You want to protect him as much as possible. And this was a huge checkpoint for the offseason that we had for Nick Krall, and Nick Krall got there. Nick Krall did it. He made the catching position deep. He gave the Reds the ability to put Tyler Stephenson in the bat in the lineup without forcing him to catch every day, and he made the strongest position group on this roster the catching group, which, as a huge fan of catchers, I'm a huge fan of what Nick Krall did this offseason because, look, the catching position will be one of the reasons that the Reds win at least 75 games this year. There's a question that a lot of folks are asking about my optimism when it comes to the Cincinnati Reds, and the biggest question that people have is David Bell. And while I have always said that I'm ambivalent about him, there's a number that I'm looking at, a number that I was thinking about that I think kind of answers the question a little bit about, is David Bell actually a good manager? We'll talk about what that is coming up here in just a minute. But first, today's podcast is sponsored by BetOnline. BetOnline is your continued number one source for all of your sports wagering information. When you go to betonline.net, you are going to get the top news, whether you're talking about the games of the day, whether you're talking about the transactions, the trades, the signings, everything that's going on. BetOnline.net has you covered. You can find all the latest player development, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every single game over at betonline.net. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for live betting as well, and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there, including the NFL, as we get into the stretch run here tonight. Depending on if you're listening to this Thursday night or if you're listening to it on Friday, it was last night. Week 16 begins. Huge week for the Cincinnati Bengals against the Buffalo Bills. They get a win here. We could be talking about the number one seed, and that is exciting. Check out Locked On Bengals for more about that. And if you want to learn more about that as well when it comes to the betting angle, head on over to betonline.net. They've also got you covered for NCAA football as we're into bowl season, and we've got the college football playoff coming up. We got college basketball, the NBA, NHL, boxing, MMA, and golf. Head on over to betonline.net on your desktop or your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action, because BetOnline is where the game starts. Thank you so much for making Locked On Reds your first listen here today, and always doing so. Coming up tomorrow, we've got our live Aloha edition of the Locked On Reds podcast. It's coming up at 1:30 p.m. That's Friday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time, as Steve and I will be looking at this offseason and another reason why the Reds could get that 75 win mark that I'm looking at. Steve kind of doesn't agree with that, but I'm working on it. I'm working on them, guys. I'm working on but a huge reason why, and it's going to be a newcomer that we didn't talk about yesterday. That's coming up here on the live edition. Plus your questions, your comments, you get to drive the ship. It's been a lot of fun here. We're going to try to make this an every Friday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern type of deal. All right, so a question mark, a hurdle that people are having a hard time getting past when it comes to the 75 win mark is David Bell. Is David Bell a good manager? And there are so many avenues that we could go down with this. And this is probably something that if we wanted to really unpack this question, we probably need multiple podcasts to do that. However, there is an idea of mine to try to simplify things, right? I like easy to digest stuff. I'm not the kind of guy that wants to look at every single number and try to point out every single thing to shut down every argument. I just need a simple point to understand things. And there really isn't a manager WAR stat, right? Like we talk about WAR with players, wins above replacement with players. It's kind of a starting point for understanding how good a guy was in a given season. But I have a thought. We could look at the projected win totals for the Reds during David Bell's tenure and then compare those to the actual win totals of each year and kind of come up with a number. Let's try this. And I know all of this isn't necessarily under his control, but a lot of this could be kind of considered so. So let's build a number here. 2019, first year on the job, the Reds were projected to win 79.5 games. They actually won 75. So negative 4.5 wins above projection, below projection in this case. 2020, they were projected to win 31.5 of the 60 game season. They won 31. So negative 0.5. So if you're counting along, that's negative 5 total wins against projection. 2021, he was above. It was 81.5 projected wins for the Reds. They actually won 83. So a positive 1.5 wins. That's going to bring it back up to just negative 3.5 wins. And then I know I'm saying a lot of numbers here, but when you're talking about projected win totals and what the Reds actually did under David Bell in 2022, they were projected to win 74.5 games. And we all know that they won 62, negative 12.5. So if you're counting along, the Reds have been 16 wins under Vegas projection since David Bell began managing. And look, I know that this is a flawed exercise, and this does not paint the whole picture, but I believe this begins to paint a picture, because I think the key when it comes to a baseball manager anymore is just to not get in the way. Players define the game. Players define the success of a team. Managers can help that out. They can put guys in the right spots. They can put them in the right, the right spots in the order. They can bring in the right reliever and things like that. But by and large, it's up to the player to actually perform when he's called upon. However, if you are getting in the way, that's a problem. And the Reds, in his 4 years as manager, have been 16 wins under Vegas projection under the tutelage of David Bell. Now, I don't think that fully explains it, especially in 2022, whenever they gutted the roster in the middle of the season and he was having to roll out a bunch of different guys. We mentioned earlier in the podcast, 69 different players played for the Reds last year. 69 different players. Nice. But I still think that there is a measure of an answer with this number of 16 wins under projection. And that is, he's not helping the team, right? Like, if he were helping the team, that number would be smaller. And would it be above 0? I don't know that that's the case because, again, the roster building doesn't lead itself to that philosophy, but he is getting in the way a little bit. And when you're talking about these young guys coming up, because when David Bell was hired, Dick Williams was here. Dick Williams was spending. He was using the payroll dollars that were allotted to him to go out and get guys, to trade for guys, to sign guys. Now we're talking about bringing players up and trying to build the bulk of the team through development. So David Bell, since he began to now, is doing totally different things. And whether or not he can be good at that, I do have some pause based on last year, because last year was the beginning of the, okay, let's run some young guys out there. Let's see what they've got. Let's see them develop. And he had 12.5 wins less than the Reds were projected. Now, does that mean that I think he torpedoes my take? No, I built David Bell into the 75 wins. I think that he's going to have more talent to work with this year with the young guys that are coming up, with the guys that they signed based on who was here after the trade deadline. I'm not arguing that the Reds pitching staff is better without Luis Castillo and Tyler Maile. That's not the case, but they could grow into that. The top 3 that the Reds have are every bit, their potential is every bit as good, if not better, than what the Reds had whenever they had Castillo, Maile, and Gray. When you're talking about Green, Lodolo, and Ashcraft, they're not there yet, but they could be very soon. And you're looking at an infield that's going to have the addition of Ellie De La Cruz, who we will talk about quite a bit tomorrow, as a huge reason why I'm optimistic about this team's possible performance in 2023. But how does the manager fit into all of this? Is he getting in the way? And the numbers would seem to suggest that, just looking at win projections compared to win totals, questions exist about whether David Bell is getting in the way. And I know that, we always hear about the players lauding him and they love how he runs the locker room and they would play for him as much as they want to play for him. But at the end of the day, I don't think he trends as an above replacement level type manager. I think that you could go out and again, we've talked about this before. If you get rid of David Bell, you're going to bring in somebody who has the same philosophies as David Bell does, a little bit more forward thinking, a little bit more analytical thinking, but melds that with, intuition and what he sees, but also organizationally minded. How does he fit in with Nick Krall? How does he fit in with what Derek Johnson and Joel McKeithen are doing with the development of the hitters and the pitchers? Like, all of that comes into play. You're not going to really change that much, but as a person and as what David Bell brings to the table, I think he's replacement level at this point. And I don't necessarily know that the Reds win because of him. Don't think it's fair to say that they totally lose because of him, but the question definitely is there. But I'll tell you what, though, and as we're analyzing some different things and taking a look at the numbers from last season, there is a statistic for hitters that define the struggles that the Reds had that we don't really talk about enough. So coming up next, I will tell you what the stat is and why the Reds are so bad at it. But first, wanted to uh, bring your attention to this. As the holidays are coming up, and this weekend, of course, we got New Year's, and there's lots of fun, lots of partying going on. If you're out and you're having a few drinks, definitely have a plan in place, because if you think that you're good enough to drive, don't. Make sure that you have a plan to get home. Make sure that you have the ability to call for a ride. Maybe it's an Uber, a Lyft, whatever it is. Have a plan to get home where you don't have to rely on yourself driving impaired, because it's not just you that you're affecting. You could affect the life of somebody else. And look, even when you're talking about affecting yourself, your insurance goes up, you lose your license, something like that. You're probably thinking, that's whatever, I can handle with that. But what if you do mess up someone else's life? You could kill somebody. Make sure you have a plan in place, because like, I know that and you know that I know the risks of driving drunk, and that the results are often tragic. However, there's a lot of folks that still does not stop them from getting behind the wheel after they've had a few too many. That's why police officers are out there right now looking for impaired drivers on our roads to save lives, to save your life, to save my life. So if you think that you're good enough, don't. Play it safe and plan ahead to get a ride. It only takes one mistake to change your life or someone else's forever. Drive sober or get pulled over. Thanks again for listening and watching today's podcast. You can follow the podcast on all platforms, including right here on YouTube. If this is your first time, thank you so much. Make sure you follow and you click that bell to get notified whenever we've got new content for you. And if you're watching here on YouTube, make sure you check us out on a Friday, because we will be live taking your comments, taking your questions. We are very active in the comment section on the Aloha Live edition on Fridays. You're not going to want to miss that. Plus, you can follow us on Twitter. You can follow me at Jeff Carr with 3 Fs. You can follow Steve at S Offenbaker with 2 Fs. And you can follow the show at Locked On Reds. All right, so there is a statistic, and I know that we've talked about some different things, position groups that hurt the Reds, different players who had subpar seasons and things like that. But looking at the team, specifically when it comes to hitting, there was a statistic that absolutely just held the lineup back. And that is, the Reds started an inning with an out way more times than they did, or than not. So hear me out on this. When it came to leading off an inning last year, or just leading off the game in general, the Reds had an on-base percentage of .286. That means that 28% of the time last season, they were getting on base to start an inning. For comparison's sake, in 2021, we know that they were much better in 2021 than 2022. But in 2021, the on-base percentage of the leadoff hitter, first hitter of the game, Jonathan India's rookie season, was .389, 103 points better than it was in 2022. And when you're leading off an inning, this is anybody. This is not just the leadoff hitter to begin the game. This is the first batter of each inning, which could be anybody in the lineup. As a team, they still had an on-base percentage of .337 in 2021. 50, right? Yeah, 51 points better than it was in 2022. And consider that number for a second, the .337 on-base percentage. Only Tyler Stephenson, Spencer Steer, Matt Reynolds, and Stuart Fairchild on the 2022 roster had a leadoff on-base percentage better than .337 last year. And all of those were in at least 26 plate appearances. So, I think with Spencer Steer had the lowest number of plate appearances leading off an inning, but he still had an on-base percentage better than .337 leading off an inning. Like, the Reds started off too many innings with an out last year. And it was a theme that Barry Larkin talked about quite a bit during the second half of the season. Strike one is the best pitch in baseball or something like that. But out number one can cripple a lineup, I think, if you follow that up. Out number one, when you just start out an inning, and think about that, 70 1% of the time, the Reds began an inning with an out. It's way too much. And I know that, this is a sport where if your on-base percentage is 400, then you're Joey Votto. So we're probably not expecting the Reds as a whole to be Joey Votto, but if they could just make that 337, 33% of the time, if they could bump that up 50 points, they bump the lineup up so much more than where it was in 2022. That's a number that I think they can improve on with better plate discipline, better pitch recognition, and just better at bats in general. But the Reds cannot start off every inning with an out. I mean, not every inning, but 70% of their innings with an out in 2023. That's going to be a huge number to watch as we get into next year. But it was just something when I was looking at the numbers the other day, kind of looking back on last season, was like, we know all these different things. The Reds struck out too much. They had terrible runners in scoring position average, all this other stuff. But not leading off the inning with somebody on base absolutely murdered them. And it's something, they got to be better about not giving away the first out of the inning in 2023. Just something to think about there as we move along. But that's going to wrap us up for this edition of the Locked On Reds podcast. Coming up tomorrow, we've got the live Aloha edition of the podcast at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. Make sure you join us on the Locked On Reds YouTube page. If you're watching right here, thank you so much. We'll see you tomorrow. We've got questions, comments. You will drive the ship as we talk about this upcoming Cincinnati Reds season. But that's going to do it for us here today. Thanks for making Locked On Reds your first listen. Now make your next listen the Locked On Sports Today podcast. They've got the biggest stories of the day. They've got instant reactions to all the big game recaps, and they've got the take of the day. That's Locked On Sports Today. Just like Locked On Reds, it's free and available on podcasts, and just like Locked On Reds, it's produced by me. I tell you what, as the offseason moves along, though, still going to be some moves. The Reds are probably going to make some different minor league signings, some different waiver claims, things like that. We're going to be all over them. We're going to be all over the rumors. And if the Reds happen to make a trade as well, you can be sure that Locked On Reds will be here every single step of the way, because we're Locked On Reds every single day.